The text message was simple enough. Family dinner Sunday, 6 p.m. Big announcement to share with everyone. Really hope you can make it this time, Marianne. My sister Jennifer's words carried that familiar undertone, the one that suggested my absence from previous gatherings hadn't gone unnoticed, and more importantly, hadn't been appreciated. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I stared at my phone screen from behind my desk at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, surrounded by stacks of policy briefings and environmental impact reports that most people would find mind-numbingly boring. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting that particular shade of institutional white that seemed to exist only in government buildings. My office wasn't much to look at: standard-issue furniture, a small window that faced another government building, and walls decorated with certificates and commendations that my family had never bothered to ask about. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, being invited to hear someone else's big announcement, while sitting on information that would probably make the evening news if it ever became public. But that was the thing about working in government, especially at the level I'd reached after 15 years of climbing the bureaucratic ladder. Discretion wasn't just expected. It was survival. I typed back quickly, "I'll be there. Looking forward to it." Short, enthusiastic enough to avoid follow-up questions, and completely honest. I was looking forward to it, though probably not for the reasons Jennifer expected. The truth was, I missed my family. Despite everything, the snide comments about my boring government job, the eye rolls when I mentioned policy work, the way conversations seemed to shift whenever I talked about my day, I genuinely missed being around them. Growing up in suburban Cleveland, we'd been close. Sunday dinners were sacred, holiday traditions were non-negotiable, and family always came first. Somewhere along the way, though, success had become the metric by which everything else was measured, and my version of success apparently didn't translate. My brother Marcus had made it easy to understand what success looked like in the Thompson family. After graduating from Ohio State with a business degree, he jumped straight into real estate development, riding the housing boom of the early 2000s like a surfer catching the perfect wave. By 30, he owned 3 properties and drove a BMW. By 35, he'd expanded into commercial development and had his face on billboards across 3 counties. Thompson Development, building dreams, creating futures. The slogan made me cringe every time I saw it, but I couldn't argue with the results. Marcus had built something tangible, something people could see and touch and measure in square footage and property values. Jennifer had taken a different but equally visible path. Marketing executive at a Fortune 500 company, she specialized in consumer goods and had a talent for making people want things they didn't know they needed. Her Instagram was a carefully curated collection of business trips, networking events, and the kind of lifestyle shots that made even casual observers feel like they were missing out on something important. She drove a white Tesla, lived in a downtown Columbus loft that had been featured in a regional design magazine, and dated men who owned restaurants or started tech companies. Then there was me, Marianne Thompson, the family's resident underachiever, at least according to the unspoken scorecard that seemed to govern every family gathering. I'd graduated summa cum laude from Georgetown with a degree in public policy, completed a master's in urban planning, and spent my entire career working my way through various federal agencies. What I did was important. Housing policy affected millions of Americans, and the work I'd been doing on affordable housing initiatives had real impact on real communities. But try explaining the intricacies of HUD Section 8 voucher reform at a family barbecue, and watch how quickly the conversation shifted to Marcus's latest property acquisition or Jennifer's promotion. The thing that stung the most wasn't the lack of understanding. I'd made peace with that years ago. It was the assumption that because my work wasn't immediately visible or profitable in the traditional sense, it wasn't valuable. "Still pushing papers for Uncle Sam," was Marcus's favorite greeting. Jennifer preferred the more subtle approach. "How's the government treating you?" delivered with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and a tone that suggested she was asking about a chronic illness rather than a career. My parents, God love them, tried to be supportive in their own way. Dad would nod seriously when I mentioned my work and make vague comments about public service being important, but I could tell he didn't really understand what I did beyond the fact that it involved a lot of meetings and report writing. Mom was more direct. "When are you going to find something in the private sector, honey? You're so smart, you could be making real money." Real money. As if my GS-14 salary was play money, as if the health insurance and pension benefits were meaningless, as if job security in an uncertain economy was something to be dismissed. The funny part was that I actually made decent money. Not Marcus money, not Jennifer money, but enough to own a nice townhouse in Arlington, drive a reliable car, and take vacations to places that weren't all-inclusive resorts in Cancun. I just didn't talk about it much because, in my family, talking about money was either bragging or complaining, and I'd learned early that my version of financial success didn't register on their scale. What they really didn't understand was the satisfaction I got from my work. When I'd started at HUD 15 years ago as a GS-7 program analyst, I was just grateful to have a job that used my education and paid the bills. But over the years, as I'd moved up through the ranks and taken on increasingly complex assignments, I discovered something that Marcus's property deals and Jennifer's marketing campaigns couldn't provide: the knowledge that what I did mattered. In ways that extended far beyond quarterly profit reports. I'd worked on disaster recovery programs that helped families rebuild after hurricanes. I'd been part of the team that developed new fair housing enforcement mechanisms, ensuring that families couldn't be discriminated against based on race or disability status. Most recently, I've been leading a cross-departmental initiative on sustainable housing development, working with EPA and the Department of Energy to create incentives for environmentally responsible construction practices. It was the kind of work that required deep knowledge of federal regulations, an understanding of how different agencies collaborated, and the ability to navigate political sensitivities that changed with each election cycle. But try explaining that at a family dinner, and I'd watch eyes glaze over faster than you could say, environmental impact assessment. It was easier for everyone if I just smiled and said, "Work's good, keeping busy," and let the conversation move on to more interesting topics like Marcus's latest renovation project or Jennifer's upcoming business trip to Los Angeles. The email notification chimed on my computer, pulling me back to the present. Another briefing request from the Deputy Secretary's office, this one marked, "Priority, Confidential." I glanced at the subject line and felt the familiar flutter of adrenaline. That came with high-level assignments. This was the part of my job that my family would never see, the part that involved conference calls with White House staff and policy recommendations that could affect federal spending in the billions. I opened the email and scanned the contents quickly. Another meeting, another briefing, another opportunity to provide input on decisions that would ripple through communities across the country. It was the kind of work that required clearance levels my family didn't even know existed, the kind of work that meant sometimes my phone rang at odd hours with requests that couldn't wait until morning. 3 years ago, I'd been selected for a detailed assignment at the White House, working with the Domestic Policy Council on housing issues. 6 months of 14-hour days, weekend meetings, and the kind of access to decision-making that most policy wonks only dreamed about. It had been exhausting, exhilarating, and career-defining. It had also been completely invisible to my family, who only knew that I'd been working on some project in Washington and seemed busier than usual. The detail had ended, and I'd returned to HUD with new responsibilities and a broader network of contacts throughout the federal government. More importantly, I'd proven myself capable of operating at the highest levels of government, capable of briefing cabinet officials and providing policy recommendations that became administration priorities. It was the kind of experience that opened doors, the kind of experience that got your name mentioned in the right conversations when opportunities arose. But sitting at that family dinner table, listening to Marcus talk about his latest commercial development deal or Jennifer describe her company's new product launch, none of that seemed to matter. Success, in my family's definition, was visible, profitable, and preferably something you could explain to a stranger in 30 seconds or less. My career, with its acronym-heavy job titles and complex policy implications, didn't fit that model. I closed the email and leaned back in my chair, looking out the small window at the late afternoon Washington traffic. Sunday dinner was still 3 days away, but I was already mentally preparing for the usual routine. Marcus would arrive in whatever expensive car he was driving these days, probably with some story about $1 million deal he'd just closed. Jennifer would come armed with photos from her latest business trip and at least one amusing anecdote about a client or colleague that would have everyone laughing. And I would sit there, smiling and nodding and deflecting questions about my work with generic responses that satisfied no one but avoided the glazed eye syndrome that came with actual details. The really frustrating part was that I'd stopped trying to impress them years ago. I'd accepted that they didn't understand what I did, didn't appreciate the importance of it, and weren't likely to change their minds. What bothered me was the underlying assumption that I'd somehow settled, that I'd chosen the easy path, that I was working below my potential. If they only knew the calls I'd been taking recently, the meetings I'd been attending, the conversations that had been happening behind closed doors. If they only knew that pushing papers for Uncle Sam sometimes meant pushing papers that could reshape federal policy and affect millions of lives, but they didn't know. And they couldn't know, and that was the burden of working in government at the level I'd reached. Discretion wasn't just professional courtesy, it was a requirement. The work I was proudest of, the achievements that had earned me recognition, within my field, were precisely the things I couldn't discuss over Sunday dinner. So I'd learned to smile and nod and let them think whatever they wanted to think about my boring government job and my quiet, unremarkable career. 3 days from now, I'd sit at that familiar dining room table in my childhood home, surrounded by the people who'd known me longest and understood me least, and I'd listen to whatever big announcement Jennifer wanted to share. I'd celebrate with genuine enthusiasm, ask the right questions, and deflect attention from my own professional life with the practiced ease of someone who'd been doing it for years. What I wouldn't tell them, what I couldn't tell them, was that my phone had been ringing a lot lately with calls from phone numbers that would make their heads spin. What I wouldn't mention was that my calendar for the next 2 weeks included meetings that required security clearances they didn't know I had. And what I definitely wouldn't share was the conversation I'd had just yesterday with someone whose voice was familiar from television news, someone who'd used words like consideration and potential opportunity and when the time is right. But that was fine. Some stories were worth waiting to tell, and some announcements were worth timing perfectly. Sunday dinner would come and go, Jennifer would share her news, and everyone would celebrate appropriately. And I would sit there, smiling and supportive, knowing that sometimes the biggest announcements were the ones you couldn't make yet. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. After all, I'd learned patience in government work. I'd learned that the most important decisions often happen slowly, behind closed doors, with careful deliberation and multiple levels of approval. I'd learned that timing was everything, that premature disclosure could derail opportunities, and that sometimes the best strategy was simply to wait. So I'd wait. I'd attend Sunday dinner, I'd listen to Jennifer's announcement, and I'd continue letting my family think whatever they wanted to think about my quiet, unremarkable government career. Because in about 2 weeks, if everything went according to plan, the conversation was going to change dramatically. And when it did, I wanted to make sure I was ready. Sunday arrived with the kind of crisp October weather that made suburban Cleveland look like a postcard. I pulled into my parents' driveway at exactly 5:58 p.m., a habit I'd developed over the years to avoid being either awkwardly early or fashionably late. The familiar sight of Marcus's black Range Rover and Jennifer's white Tesla already parked outside told me I was the last to arrive, which meant everyone would already be settled in with drinks and appetizers by the time I walked through the door. Mom answered before I could finish knocking, wrapping me in the same lavender-scented hug she'd been giving me since I was 5 years old. "Marianne, you look wonderful. How was the drive from DC?" She was already leading me toward the kitchen, where the sounds of conversation and clinking glasses suggested the evening was well underway. "Not bad, made good time," I replied, following her past the living room where Dad was settled in his favorite recliner, remote control in hand, half watching a football game while keeping one ear on the kitchen conversation. He raised his beer bottle in greeting, and I waved back, noting that he looked older somehow, more tired than when I'd seen him last. The kitchen was exactly as I'd expected. Marcus sat at the breakfast bar, sleeves rolled up, gesturing broadly with a glass of what looked like expensive whiskey while Jennifer perched on a stool beside him, looking perfectly put together in a way that suggested she'd spent considerable time getting ready for a family dinner. Mom was bustling around, putting finishing touches on a spread that could have fed twice as many people, and the familiar comfort of home cooking filled the air. "There she is," Marcus called out as I entered, his tone carrying that particular brand of jovial condescension I'd grown accustomed to. "The government worker herself. Still fighting the good fight in Washington?" "Something like that," I replied, accepting the glass of wine Mom pressed into my hand. It was good wine, I noticed, probably something Marcus had brought. He had a habit of showing up with expensive bottles, not out of generosity so much as the desire to ensure everyone knew he could afford expensive bottles. Jennifer slid off her stool to give me a hug, and I caught a whiff of her perfume, something French and expensive that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. "You look great, Marianne. I love what you've done with your hair." It was a kind comment, genuinely delivered, and I reminded myself that Jennifer wasn't malicious, just operating from a completely different set of assumptions about what constituted success and happiness. "Thanks. You look amazing as always." And she did. Jennifer had inherited Mom's bone structure and Dad's height, giving her the kind of natural elegance that photographs well and commands attention in boardrooms. She'd also inherited their instinct for presentation, always appearing perfectly assembled regardless of the circumstances. We made small talk while Mom finished dinner preparations, Marcus's latest property acquisition, a strip mall renovation that was apparently going very well. Jennifer's recent promotion to senior vice president, complete with a corner office and expense account, my non-committal responses about work being busy and Washington being Washington. It was the familiar dance we'd perfected over years of family Gatherings, polite and surface level and carefully avoiding any topics that might require actual depth or vulnerability. Dinner was served with the usual Thompson family ceremony. Dad said grace, thanking God for family and food and health, while we all held hands around the table like we had when we were kids. Mom had outdone herself, pot roast with all the traditional sides, homemade bread, and a salad that looked like it belonged in a magazine. This was comfort food elevated to an art form, the kind of meal that represented hours of preparation and decades of perfecting recipes. The conversation flowed easily enough through the first course. Marcus regaled us with stories from his latest business trip to Atlanta, complete with impressions of potential investors and amusing observations about Southern business culture. Jennifer shared updates from her company, describing a product launch that had exceeded expectations and a marketing campaign that was generating buzz in industry publications. Dad talked about his retirement activities, golf lessons, a woodworking class at the community center, plans to refinish the deck next spring. I found myself relaxing despite my earlier apprehensions. This was the family I remembered, the family I'd grown up with before success became the primary lens through which everything was viewed. We were just people sharing a meal and catching up on each other's lives, and for a moment I let myself forget about the professional distance that had grown between us over the years. Then Jennifer cleared her throat and set down her fork with the kind of deliberate precision that suggested we'd reached the main event of the evening. So, she began, her smile bright and expectant, I have some news to share with everyone. She reached for her purse, pulling out a small velvet box that made my mother gasp and my father straighten in his chair. David proposed last weekend. We're engaged. The explosion of excitement was immediate and genuine. Mom was on her feet and around the table before Jennifer could even open the box to show off what was clearly an impressive diamond ring. Dad was shaking David's hand. When had he arrived? I must have missed his entrance while I was focused on the family dynamics and offering congratulations. Marcus was laughing and calling for champagne, which apparently he'd had the foresight to bring and chill. I joined the celebration, of course, hugging Jennifer and admiring her ring and expressing all the appropriate enthusiasm for what was genuinely happy news. David was a good guy, a pediatric surgeon at Cleveland Clinic, smart and funny and completely devoted to Jennifer. They'd been dating for 2 years, and anyone paying attention could have seen this coming. It was exactly the kind of announcement that would make any family proud, exactly the kind of milestone that deserved celebration. But as the initial excitement died down and we all settled back into our seats with champagne glasses filled, I realized that this moment was going to become a launching pad for something I wasn't prepared for. A doctor and a marketing executive, Mom said, beaming as she raised her glass. What a power couple you're going to be. The wedding planning is going to be incredible, Jennifer continued, already pulling out her phone to show photos of potential venues. David's parents have offered to help with costs, and we're thinking next fall, maybe in Napa Valley. Something elegant but not too formal. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting into what I recognized as his big brother lecture mode. You know what this means, don't you, Marianne? You're officially the last single Thompson. Mom and Dad are going to start getting desperate for grandchildren, and all the pressure's going to fall on you. It was meant to be teasing, the kind of harmless ribbing that siblings inflicted on each other at family gatherings. But something in his tone, some undercurrent of condescension, made it feel less like teasing and more like an indictment. Marcus, Mom said, her voice carrying a warning note, but Jennifer was already laughing and picking up the thread. Oh, come on, Marianne's got plenty of time. She's focused on her career right now. Government work is so stable, she doesn't have to worry about the same pressures the rest of us face. Stable. The word hung in the air like an accusation dressed up as a compliment. Stable, meaning safe. Meaning unchallenging. Meaning the kind of work you did when you weren't brave enough or ambitious enough or talented enough to take real risks. Besides, Marcus added, warming to the theme, it's not like she has to worry about market fluctuations or client demands. Government jobs are basically recession-proof, right? Show up, push some papers around, collect your paycheck, go home at 5. It must be nice to have that kind of security. I felt something shift inside me, a familiar tightness in my chest that I'd been dealing with for years but had never quite learned to ignore. This was the moment when I usually deflected, changed the subject, made some self-deprecating joke about my boring job and moved the conversation back to safer ground. This was when I usually chose peace over pride, family harmony over personal dignity, but something was different tonight. Maybe it was the champagne, or maybe it was the accumulation of years of small slights and casual dismissals. Maybe it was the knowledge of what was sitting in my email inbox back in Arlington, or the memory of yesterday's phone call from a number with a 202 area code that had made my hand shake when I saw it on my caller ID. Actually, I heard myself saying, it's not quite that simple. The table went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of people pausing in conversation, but the charged quiet that preceded either an explosion or a revelation. Everyone was looking at me with expressions ranging from mild curiosity to outright surprise. It had been so long since I'd pushed back against their assumptions that they seemed genuinely shocked by the possibility that I might have something to say. I mean, Jennifer said, her tone still light but with an edge of uncertainty, it's great that you enjoy your work, Marianne. We just meant that government jobs are more predictable than what Marcus and I deal with. More predictable. Code for less demanding, less important, less worthy of respect or recognition. Right, Marcus chimed in, apparently missing the tension entirely. No offense, but you've got to admit that pushing papers for HUD isn't exactly high-stakes work. It's not like you're making deals that could make or break companies, or developing marketing strategies that determine whether products succeed or fail. Pushing papers for HUD. There it was again, the phrase that had become Marcus's go-to dismissal of everything I'd worked for over the past 15 years. The phrase that reduced my career to its most mundane possible interpretation, that ignored the complexity and importance of federal housing policy, that dismissed the impact of work that affected millions of American families. Marcus, Dad said. Quietly, but I was already talking. You know what, Marcus? You're right. It's not like I'm making deals that could make or break companies. What I'm doing might actually matter a little bit more than that. The words came out sharper than I'd intended, carrying years of accumulated frustration and disappointment. The table went completely silent now, the kind of silence that made the tick of the dining room clock seem loud. Jennifer set down her champagne glass carefully. Marianne, we didn't mean, no, it's fine, I said, though it clearly wasn't fine, and everyone knew it. I get it. Government work isn't as exciting as flipping houses or launching products. It doesn't come with the same financial rewards or social recognition. But pushing papers for HUD, as you put it, happens to involve developing policies that determine whether families have affordable housing or end up homeless. Marcus opened his mouth to say something, but I wasn't finished. Those papers I push? They become federal regulations that protect people from housing discrimination. They become funding formulas that determine how much disaster relief communities receive after hurricanes and floods. They become environmental standards that ensure low-income families aren't forced to live in buildings that could make their children sick. The silence stretched on, growing more uncomfortable by the second. Mom was staring at her plate, clearly wishing she could make this conversation disappear. Dad was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Jennifer and David were exchanging glances that suggested they were wondering how a celebration had turned into whatever this was becoming, but Marcus, bless his heart, couldn't leave it alone. Okay, but come on, Marianne. You've been doing this for what, 15 years? And you're still basically in the same job you started with. When was the last time you got a real promotion? When was the last time someone noticed your work outside of your little government bubble? It was the worst possible thing he could have said at the worst possible time. Because the truth was, people had been noticing my work outside of my little government bubble. Important people. People whose names appeared in newspapers and whose decisions affected national policy. People who had been having quiet conversations about my qualifications and experience and potential for several months now, but I couldn't say that. I couldn't explain that I'd been detailed to the White House, that I'd briefed cabinet secretaries, that my recommendations had become administration priorities. I couldn't mention the security clearances or the confidential meetings or the phone calls that had to be taken in secure locations. I couldn't describe the work I was most proud of because that work was classified or sensitive or both. So instead, I sat there, feeling 15 years of professional accomplishments reduced to basically the same job and little government bubble. And I realized that nothing I could say would change their fundamental assumptions about what I did or why it mattered. You're right, Marcus, I said finally. I'm still basically doing the same job I started with. Still pushing papers for Uncle Sam. Still living my quiet, unremarkable life in my little government bubble. The sarcasm was thick enough to cut with a knife, but Marcus seemed to take it at face value, nodding with the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully made his point. I don't understand why you're getting so defensive, Jennifer said, her voice taking on the patient tone she probably used with difficult clients. We're proud of you for finding work that makes you happy. We just think you might be happier if you considered other options, that's all. Other options. As if I'd stumbled into government work by accident and had simply been too lazy or unimaginative to consider alternatives. As if 15 years of deliberate career building had been a series of random choices rather than strategic decisions. What Jennifer's trying to say, Mom interjected, clearly hoping to smooth over the growing tension, is that we want you to have all the same opportunities for success that Marcus and Jennifer have had. We want you to be able to afford nice things, to travel, to have the security that comes with a really good salary. The security that comes with a really good salary. From the woman whose retirement was entirely dependent on Dad's pension from the county government where he'd worked for 37 years. The irony was so thick I almost laughed, but I didn't laugh. Instead, I nodded and smiled and said all the right things about appreciating their concern and being happy with my choices and looking forward to hearing more about wedding plans. I deflected and redirected and got through the rest of dinner without causing any more scenes or uncomfortable moments, and as I drove back to Arlington later that evening, replaying the conversation over and over in my mind, I realized something important had changed. I'd spent years accepting their dismissive comments about my work, their assumptions about my limitations, their casual disregard for everything I'd accomplished. I'd told myself it didn't matter, that their opinions couldn't hurt me, that I was secure enough in my own achievements to ignore their lack of understanding, but tonight had proven me wrong. It did matter. It did hurt. And I was tired of pretending otherwise. More than that, I was tired of protecting them from the truth about what I actually did, what I'd actually accomplished, and what opportunities were actually available to someone with my experience and qualifications. I'd been discretionary to the point of invisibility, professional to the point of self-erasure. Maybe it was time for that to change. The drive back to Arlington gave me 2 hours and 43 minutes to think, and by the time I pulled into my garage, I'd made a decision that would have surprised my family almost as much as it surprised me. I wasn't going to keep protecting them anymore. I sat in my car for a moment after turning off the engine, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the distant hum of Sunday night traffic on Route 66. My townhouse looked exactly the same as it had when I'd left that morning, neat, modest, unremarkable from the outside. The kind of place that wouldn't raise eyebrows or invite questions about how a government employee could afford something nicer. I'd been deliberately understated in everything, from my car to my clothes to my house, partly out of genuine preference, and partly out of a misguided desire to avoid making my family feel uncomfortable about the differences in our financial situations. But sitting there in the dark, replaying Marcus's words about my basically the same job and my little government bubble, I realized how thoroughly I'd been managing their perceptions of my life, and how completely I'd been failing to manage my own. Inside, I poured myself a glass of wine, not the expensive bottle Marcus had brought to dinner, but a perfectly decent Pinot Noir from a Virginia vineyard that I discovered during a weekend trip to Charlottesville. I settled into my home office, a converted bedroom that looked nothing like the cramped government spaces where I spent my days. Here, I had a view of a small garden, custom-built bookshelves, and a desk large enough to spread out briefing materials when I brought work home. The red light on my secure phone was blinking. 3 missed calls, all from the same number, all with timestamps from this afternoon while I'd been enduring dinner conversation about my lack of ambition and limited prospects. I dialed into the voicemail system and listened to a message that would have made Marcus choke on his expensive whiskey. Miss Thompson, this is Janet Morrison from the White House Personnel Office. I know it's Sunday, but we've had some developments regarding the position we discussed. Please call me back this evening if possible, regardless of the time. We need to move more quickly than anticipated. Janet Morrison, Deputy Director of Presidential Personnel. The woman responsible for vetting and recommending candidates for senior government positions, including cabinet appointments. We'd had 3 conversations over the past month, each one more specific than the last, each one moving closer to something I still couldn't quite believe was really happening. I stared at the phone for a long moment, thinking about timing and irony and the strange way life sometimes arranged itself into patterns that seemed too neat to be coincidental. 5 hours ago, I'd been sitting at my parents' dining table, listening to my brother explain why my career was evidence of limited ambition and my sister suggesting that government work was for people who couldn't handle real challenges. Now, I was holding a message from the White House Personnel Office about a cabinet position. The callback took 47 minutes. 47 minutes of the most important conversation of my professional life, conducted from my quiet home office while my family was probably still sitting around that dining table, discussing wedding venues and honeymoon destinations and perhaps making additional observations about my disappointing career trajectory. We need to accelerate the timeline, Janet explained after the preliminary pleasantries. The current secretary is stepping down sooner than expected, family health issues that require her immediate attention. The president wants someone in place who can hit the ground running, someone with deep knowledge of the department and existing relationships on the Hill. Someone like me, she meant. Someone who'd spent 15 years learning the intricacies of federal housing policy, who'd worked with congressional staff on appropriations committees, who understood the balance between political priorities and bureaucratic realities. Someone who'd already proven capable of operating at the highest levels of government through the White House detail and subsequent high-profile assignments. The formal announcement process will begin Tuesday, she continued. Background check update, financial disclosure review, the full package. We're looking at a nomination announcement within 2 weeks, confirmation hearings to follow immediately. The president wants to move quickly on this. 2 weeks. 2 weeks from a Sunday dinner where my family had expressed concern about my limited advancement opportunities to a potential cabinet nomination. The timing was so absurd it was almost funny. I understand this is short notice, Janet said, and I know you'll need time to consider the personal and professional implications. But I need to ask, are you prepared to move forward with this? Are you ready for the level of scrutiny and public attention that comes with a cabinet position? Was I ready? I'd been preparing for this possibility since my first day at HUD, building expertise and relationships and credibility without ever quite admitting to myself that I was building them for something this significant. I'd taken every challenging assignment, worked every high-profile detail, accepted every opportunity to expand my knowledge and prove my competence. I'd been ready for years, I just hadn't known what I was getting ready for. Yes, I told her. I'm ready. The rest of the conversation covered logistics and timelines, disclosure requirements, and preparation schedules. There would be briefing sessions with White House staff, practice confirmation hearings with former senators, media training to prepare for the inevitable scrutiny that came with cabinet nominations. My life was about to become very public very quickly, and there would be no way to maintain the quiet anonymity I'd preserved for so many years. After hanging up, I sat in my office for a long time, processing what had just happened and what it meant for everything that came next. In 2 weeks, my name would be in newspapers across the country. My biography would be dissected by political reporters and policy analysts. My qualifications would be debated on cable news shows and in congressional hearings. The quiet government career that my family had been politely dismissing for 15 years was about to become very loud indeed, but before any of that happened, I had decisions to make about how much to tell them and when to tell them. The nomination would be public soon enough, but until then, I was bound by the same confidentiality requirements that had kept me silent about so many other aspects of my work. I couldn't call Marcus and Jennifer tonight and explain that while they'd been lecturing me about my limited prospects, I'd been under consideration for a position that would make me one of the most senior women in the federal government. I couldn't. But part of me desperately wanted to. Instead, I opened my laptop and began what would become a familiar routine over the next 2 weeks, researching myself. If I was going to be subject to the kind of public scrutiny that came with cabinet nominations, I needed to understand what that scrutiny would reveal. I needed to see my own career through the eyes of reporters and opposition researchers and confirmation committee staff. What I found was reassuring and somewhat surprising. 15 years of deliberate competence had created a paper trail that looked impressive when viewed from the outside. Publications in policy journals, speaking engagements at academic conferences, testimony before congressional subcommittees. Awards and commendations that I'd accepted quietly and filed away without much fanfare. Performance evaluations that consistently rated my work as exceptional. A track record of successful policy development and program management that would stand up to scrutiny. More importantly, what I didn't find was equally reassuring. No financial irregularities, no ethical compromises, no personal scandals or professional missteps that could derail a nomination. I'd lived my entire adult life with the kind of boring integrity that made confirmation hearings straightforward, though I'd never consciously planned it that way. I'd just tried to do good work and live a decent life, and it turned out that was exactly the kind of background that qualified someone for senior government service. The irony wasn't lost on me. My family's criticism of my career choices, too cautious, too conventional, too focused on security rather than advancement, had actually created exactly the kind of professional profile that led to cabinet nominations. The boring government job they'd been encouraging me to leave had prepared me for opportunities they couldn't have imagined. I spent the rest of the evening reading background materials Janet had sent over, familiarizing myself with the current policy priorities and political dynamics that would shape my potential tenure as secretary. The work was fascinating and challenging and exactly the kind of complex policy development I'd been training for my entire career. It was also completely different from anything my family imagined when they thought about what I did all day. By midnight, I developed something approaching a strategy for the next 2 weeks. I would continue my normal routine as much as possible, avoiding any behavior that might signal a major change in my circumstances. I would complete the background check and disclosure requirements efficiently and thoroughly. I would prepare for confirmation hearings with the same methodical approach I'd used for every other professional challenge. And I would wait to tell my family until after the president made the announcement public. This decision was partly practical. I was bound by confidentiality requirements that made early disclosure impossible, but it was also personal. 4. 15 years, I'd been deflecting their questions about my work, downplaying my accomplishments, and protecting them from the complexity and importance of what I actually did. I'd let them maintain their comfortable assumptions about my limited ambitions and modest achievements because it was easier than explaining the realities of federal government service at the senior level, but those days were ending. In 2 weeks, every assumption they'd made about my career would be proven spectacularly wrong, and they would have to reconcile their dismissive attitudes with the reality of a sister and daughter who'd been nominated for one of the most important positions in the federal government. The anticipation was both terrifying and satisfying in equal measure. Monday morning arrived with the usual routine: coffee, news, a careful review of my calendar to identify any conflicts with the intense preparation schedule I was about to begin. I drove to work through the familiar DC traffic, parked in the same government garage I'd been using for years, and took the elevator to an office that would soon be exchanged for something significantly more prestigious. The transformation began immediately. Janet Morrison had arranged for me to be temporarily detailed to a transition office in the executive office building, where I would spend the next 2 weeks preparing for what everyone hoped would be a swift confirmation process. The office was nondescript but functional, with secure communications and access to the briefing materials I would need to master before my first meeting with the president. I was going to meet with the President of the United States, not as a mid-level policy analyst or even as a senior bureaucrat, but as his nominee for a cabinet position. The magnitude of that reality hadn't fully sunk in yet, but I could feel it hovering at the edges of my consciousness, waiting for a quiet moment to overwhelm me completely. My first briefing session was scheduled for Tuesday morning, followed by meetings with congressional liaison staff, media advisors, and former cabinet secretaries who could provide perspective on the confirmation process. The schedule was intensive and demanding, exactly the kind of high-stakes preparation that my family would have assumed was far beyond my capabilities or experience. But as I settled into the temporary office and began reviewing the materials that would consume my attention for the next 14 days, I realized that everything in my career had been leading to this moment. Every policy briefing I'd written, every congressional hearing I'd attended, every complex negotiation I'd navigated, had been preparation for exactly this kind of opportunity. I was ready, in ways that even I hadn't fully understood until now. And in 2 weeks, my family was going to discover just how ready I'd been all along. The secure phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Another call from Janet Morrison, with updates on the timeline and additional preparation requirements. As I listened to her outline the intensive process ahead, I found myself smiling for the first time since Sunday dinner. Let Marcus continue believing I was pushing papers in my little government bubble. Let Jennifer keep thinking my work was stable and predictable and unchallenging. Let them all maintain their comfortable assumptions about my limited prospects and modest ambitions. They would learn the truth soon enough, and when they did, it would reframe every conversation we'd ever had about my career in ways that would probably keep them awake at night for months. But for now, I had a cabinet nomination to prepare for, and that preparation was going to require every skill I'd developed and every relationship I'd built over 15 years of deliberately excellent government service. It was time to stop being modest about my accomplishments and start being strategic about my future. The quiet phase of my career was officially over. The call came on a Thursday morning at 7:47 a.m., exactly 2 weeks after Sunday dinner. I was in my temporary office in the executive office building, reviewing confirmation hearing prep materials, when my secure phone displayed a number that made my pulse quicken, the direct line to the Oval Office. Ms. Thompson? Please hold for the President. 14 days of intensive preparation had led to this moment. 14 days of policy briefings, mock hearings, media training, and background investigations. 14 days of the most rigorous vetting process in American government, all leading to a conversation that would either launch me into the highest echelons of public service or send me back to my quiet anonymity at HUD. "Marianne," came the familiar voice I'd heard countless times on television but never directed personally at me. "I hope you're ready for this." The president's tone was warm but businesslike, the voice of someone who made decisions that affected millions of people and didn't have time for lengthy pleasantries. We'd met twice during the vetting process, once for a formal interview that had lasted 90 minutes, and once for what his staff had called a chemistry check, a more informal conversation to ensure we could work together effectively. "I'm ready, Mr. President." "Good. We're announcing your nomination at 2 o'clock today. Rose Garden ceremony, full press corps. Janet tells me you've been through the preparation process, so you know what to expect. I'll make the announcement, you'll say a few words, and then the real work begins. 2 o'clock today. In 6 hours and 13 minutes, my name would be spoken aloud by the President of the United States as his nominee for Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. In 6 hours and 13 minutes, everything my family thought they knew about my career would be proven spectacularly wrong. The confirmation process will move quickly, the president continued. Senator Williams chairs the committee, and she's committed to expedited hearings. You'll need to be ready for intense scrutiny, but your background check came back cleaner than most career diplomats. Janet says you've been preparing well. Yes, sir. I understand the timeline and the requirements. Excellent. One more thing, Marianne. I want you to know why you're getting this nomination. It's not because you're a safe choice or because you won't rock the boat. It's because you understand this department better than anyone else in government, and you're not afraid to make the hard decisions that need to be made. Housing policy affects every American family, and I need someone who won't back down from difficult conversations with Congress, with developers, or with anyone else who thinks housing is just another commodity to be traded. The weight of that responsibility settled over me like a physical presence. In a few hours, I wouldn't just be Marianne Thompson, the career civil servant with the boring government job. I would be the president's nominee for a cabinet position, responsible for policies that affected millions of American families' access to safe, affordable housing. I won't let you down, Mr. President. I know you won't. See you at 2. The line went dead, and I sat in my temporary office, staring at the phone and trying to process what had just happened. In 36 hours, I would be standing in the Rose Garden, being introduced to the American people as the president's choice to lead a federal department with a budget of $47 billion and responsibility for housing programs that served over 5 million families. But first, I had a text message to send. I pulled out my personal phone and opened the family group chat that had been dormant since Sunday dinner. The last message was still Jennifer's photo of her engagement ring, followed by a string of congratulatory emojis and excited responses about wedding planning. It seemed like months ago, though it had been exactly 14 days. I typed carefully. Turn on the news at 2 p.m. today. Rose Garden ceremony. I think you'll find it interesting. I stared at the message for a long moment before hitting send. It was perfectly innocuous, giving nothing away while guaranteeing they would be watching when the president made his announcement. After 15 years of deflecting their questions about my work and downplaying my accomplishments, I was about to let the most powerful person in the world explain exactly what I'd been doing with my career. The responses came immediately. Jennifer, what's happening at 2? Everything okay? Marcus, please tell me you're not getting laid off. Government cutbacks? Mom, honey, you're worrying us. What's going on? I didn't respond. In 3 hours and 47 minutes, they would have their answers. The morning flew by in a blur of final preparations. A last-minute briefing on current departmental initiatives, a review of my prepared remarks for the ceremony, and a wardrobe consultation with a White House aide who seemed genuinely excited about the historic nature of the nomination. If confirmed, I would be only the third woman to serve as HUD secretary, and the first to have risen through the career civil service rather than being appointed from outside government. At 1:30, I was escorted to a holding room adjacent to the Rose Garden, where I had 28 minutes to review my notes one final time and try to calm the adrenaline that was making my hands shake slightly. Through the windows, I could see the familiar setup of a presidential announcement: podium bearing the presidential seal, rows of chairs for the press corps, cameras positioned to capture every angle of what was about to unfold. Janet Morrison appeared at my side with a final checklist of logistics and reminders. Remember, after the president speaks, you'll have about 3 minutes for your own remarks. Keep them short, gracious, and focused on your commitment to the mission. Don't get drawn into policy specifics, that's what confirmation hearings are for. At 1:58, we walked through the colonnade toward the Rose Garden. The autumn afternoon was crisp and clear, perfect weather for a presidential announcement. I could hear the murmur of conversation from the assembled reporters, could see the red lights of television cameras already rolling, capturing B-roll footage that would accompany the evening news coverage, and somewhere in Cleveland, my family was probably gathered around someone's television, wondering what I'd been talking about in my cryptic text message. The president appeared at exactly 2 p.m., walking briskly toward the podium with the confidence of someone who'd delivered thousands of public remarks. I followed a respectful distance behind, taking my position off to the side where I could watch both the president and the assembled press corps. Good afternoon, he began, and the crowd fell silent immediately. I'm here today to announce my nomination for a critical position in our administration. The Department of Housing and Urban Development plays a vital role in ensuring that every American family has access to safe, affordable housing, and in these challenging economic times, that mission has never been more important. I could imagine my family's confusion growing. HUD, Housing and Urban Development. The same department where I'd been pushing papers for 15 years, the same boring government agency that Marcus loved to dismiss as bureaucratic nonsense. The person I'm nominating to lead HUD brings 15 years of deep experience in federal housing policy, a track record of successful program management, and the expertise necessary to navigate complex challenges in affordable housing, community development, and fair housing enforcement. 15 years of experience. My entire career, summarized in presidential remarks and about to be broadcast on every major news network in the country. She has served with distinction at every level of the department, from program analyst to senior policy advisor. She has briefed congressional committees, led interagency initiatives, and developed innovative approaches to some of our most pressing housing challenges. Most importantly, she understands that housing policy isn't about statistics and budgets, it's about families and communities and the fundamental American promise that hard work should be rewarded with the opportunity to build a stable, secure life. I could feel the cameras turning toward me as the president's remarks built toward the actual announcement. In Cleveland, my family was probably starting to understand what they were witnessing, though I doubted they fully grasped the magnitude of what was happening. It gives me great pleasure to announce my nomination of Mary Ann Elizabeth Thompson as the next Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. The words hit the air like a thunderclap, and I felt the full weight of the moment settle over me. Mary Ann Elizabeth Thompson. My full name, spoken by the President of the United States in an official nomination announcement that was being broadcast live on every major news network in the country. The applause from the assembled staff and press was polite and professional, but I barely heard it. I was thinking about Marcus, who'd spent 15 years dismissing my work as paper-pushing. I was thinking about Jennifer, who'd suggested that government jobs were for people who couldn't handle real challenges. I was thinking about my parents, who'd worried that I wasn't ambitious enough to achieve real success. The president gestured for me to join him at the podium, and I walked forward on legs that felt steadier than they had any right to feel. This was the moment I'd been preparing for my entire career, even when I hadn't known I was preparing for it. Thank you, Mr. President, I began, looking directly into the cameras that would carry my words to millions of Americans, including for very specific Americans in Cleveland who were probably sitting in stunned silence. I am deeply honored by this nomination and humbled by the confidence you've placed in me. The prepared remarks flowed smoothly, 3 minutes of carefully crafted language about commitment to public service, dedication to HUD's mission, and gratitude for the opportunity to serve the American people. But even as I spoke the words I'd practiced dozens of times, part of my mind was focused on a different audience entirely. I was speaking to my family, the people who'd never quite understood what I did or why it mattered. I was speaking to everyone who'd ever dismissed government service as a fallback career for people who couldn't succeed in the private sector. I was speaking to every person who'd ever assumed that quiet competence was the same thing as limited ambition. The work ahead will be challenging, I continued, but I've spent my entire career preparing for exactly these challenges. Housing policy affects every American community, and I'm committed to bringing both expertise and innovation to this critical mission. When I finished my remarks and stepped back from the podium, the president shook my hand with the kind of firm grip that conveyed confidence and support. The cameras captured every moment, every gesture, every expression that would be analyzed and discussed on cable news shows for the rest of the day. As we walked back toward the White House, I could hear reporters already calling out questions that would shape the evening news coverage. Ms. Thompson, what's your first priority as secretary? What experience prepares you for this role? How do you respond to critics who say you're an unknown quantity? Unknown quantity. If they only knew how well known I was within the federal housing policy community, how many congressional staff members had my phone number, how many industry leaders had sought my input on complex regulatory issues. But that was the beauty of career civil service, you could build enormous expertise and influence while remaining largely invisible to the general public, until the President of the United States nominated you for his cabinet, and suddenly, your entire career became a matter of public record and national interest. The Rose Garden ceremony ended at 2:17 p.m., but the real show was just beginning. In Cleveland, for people who'd been casually dismissing my career for 15 years were probably staring at their television screens, trying to reconcile the sister and daughter they thought they knew with the woman who'd just been nominated for one of the most important positions in the federal government. My phone was already buzzing with notifications, text messages, missed calls, email alerts from news organizations that had somehow gotten my personal contact information. The quiet anonymity I'd maintained for my entire adult life was officially over, replaced by the intense scrutiny that came with cabinet nominations. But first, I had 3 text messages that mattered more than all the others combined. Marcus, holy shit. That was you. Jennifer, Mary Ann, I can't even. I had no idea, why didn't you tell us? "Mom, we're so proud of you, honey. We had no idea you were being considered for something like this." I stared at the messages for a long moment, thinking about 15 years of Sunday dinners and casual dismissals and gentle suggestions that I might be happier in the private sector. I thought about Marcus's lectures on ambition and Jennifer's concerns about my limited prospects. I thought about all the times I'd bitten my tongue rather than explain the complexity and importance of what I actually did. Then I typed back, "Surprise." It was time for some longer conversations, but those could wait. Right now, I had a confirmation process to navigate, and that process was going to require every skill I'd developed over 15 years of career civil service. The family who'd worried about my lack of ambition was about to discover just how ambitious their boring government employee had actually been all along. Within 3 hours of the Rose Garden ceremony, my life had become unrecognizable. By 5:30 p.m., my nomination was the lead story on every major news network. By 6 p.m., my Wikipedia page had been created and was being edited in real time by volunteers adding details about my career trajectory. By 7 p.m., my Georgetown University alumni magazine had already called requesting an interview for their next issue, but the real entertainment was happening on social media, where the power of modern information sharing was about to teach my family a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. I was sitting in my Arlington townhouse, still wearing the navy blue suit I'd chosen for the ceremony, scrolling through Twitter on my laptop while fielding calls from reporters and well-wishers. The White House communications team had already briefed me on the media strategy: stay positive, emphasize qualifications and experience, defer policy questions to the confirmation process. Standard playbook for cabinet nominations, executed with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. But what they hadn't prepared me for was watching my entire professional biography get dissected and celebrated by strangers on the internet while my family presumably sat in Cleveland, realizing how completely they'd misunderstood my career. The first tweet that caught my attention came from Sarah Chen, a housing policy reporter for the Washington Post who'd covered my work on several occasions. Over the years, huge news: Marianne Thompson nominated for HUD secretary. Been following her work for years. This is someone who knows housing policy inside and out. Thread on why this is such a smart pick. 1/12". I clicked through her thread, watching her explain my career trajectory to her 47,000 followers in terms that would have been enlightening for my family, had they been paying attention to my actual work over the past 15 years. Thompson started at HUD as a GS-7 program analyst in 2008, right after the housing crisis. She's literally grown up with post-crisis housing policy. 2/12". She led the team that redesigned Section 8 voucher distribution algorithms, making the system more efficient and equitable. That work alone affected over 2 million families. 3/12". In 2019, she was detailed to the White House Domestic Policy Council. Worked directly with cabinet secretaries on housing provisions in major legislation. 4/12". She's testified before Congress 14 times. Published 23 peer-reviewed articles on housing policy. Speaks fluent Spanish and conversational Mandarin, crucial for HUD's diverse constituencies. May 12. By the time I finished reading her thread, it had been retweeted 342 times and had garnered over 1,200 likes. The comments were equally illuminating: housing advocates celebrating the nomination, policy experts praising my qualifications, former colleagues sharing stories about working with me on various initiatives. Then I saw something that made me laugh out loud. Someone had screenshot Marcus's LinkedIn profile and posted it with the caption, "Imagine telling your sister who's about to become HUD secretary that she needs to get a real job in the private sector." The post was already going viral, with hundreds of retweets and comments ranging from gentle mockery to outright disbelief that anyone could be so oblivious to their own sister's accomplishments. My phone rang. "Jennifer. Marianne, we need to talk." Her voice sounded strained, like she'd been crying or arguing or both. "This is insane. Why didn't you tell us this was happening?" "I couldn't tell you," I said simply. "Cabinet nominations are confidential until they're announced. I was bound by disclosure rules." "But, cabinet nominations? Marianne, we thought you were just—" "I mean, we didn't realize," she trailed off, and I could hear the exact moment when the magnitude of her misunderstanding hit her. For 15 years, she'd been offering career advice to someone who was apparently qualified for one of the most senior positions in the federal government. For 15 years, she'd been suggesting that I consider other options, while I was building exactly the kind of expertise that led to cabinet nominations. "Jennifer, what exactly did you think I was doing all these years?" The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and embarrassed. "I thought you were filing paperwork and attending boring meetings. I thought you were, I don't know, satisfied with a safe job that didn't require much ambition." Safe job. The phrase hung between us like an accusation. A safe job that required Senate confirmation and presidential appointment. A safe job that came with a security detail and the responsibility for a $47 billion budget. Jennifer, I've been briefing congressional committees since 2015. I've testified before the Senate Banking Committee 4 times. I spent 6 months working directly with the White House staff on housing provisions in the Infrastructure Investment Act. What part of that sounds like filing paperwork? But you never said, you never told us. I tried to tell you. Remember last Christmas when I mentioned the congressional hearing on fair housing enforcement? Marcus changed the subject to his new property acquisition. Remember when I said I was working on interagency coordination for disaster recovery? Mom asked when I was going to get a job with better hours. The truth was settling over her like cold water. Every time I'd tried to share details about my work, they dismissed it as boring government bureaucracy. Every time I'd mentioned an accomplishment, they'd responded with suggestions about how I could do better in the private sector. They'd trained me to stop talking about my job by making it clear they weren't interested in understanding what my job actually involved. Marianne, I'm so sorry. We didn't understand. No, you didn't want to understand. There's a difference. My second line was ringing. I could see it was Marcus. I have to take another call, Jennifer. We'll talk later. I switched lines. Marcus. Jesus. Christ, Marianne. I just spent 2 hours on Google reading about your career. Why the hell didn't you tell us you were some kind of housing policy expert? Some kind of housing policy expert. As if expertise in federal housing policy was a hobby I'd picked up on weekends rather than a professional specialization I'd been building for 15 years. I did tell you, Marcus. Every time you asked about my work, I tried to explain what I was doing. You never wanted to hear it. But this is huge. This is a cabinet position. You're going to be in the president's cabinet. The awe in his voice was gratifying, but it was also frustrating. It had taken a presidential nomination for him to realize that my work might actually be important. 15 years of trying to explain the significance of housing policy, and it took seeing my name on CNN for him to understand that I might know what I was talking about. Yes, Marcus. It's a cabinet position. The same department where I've been pushing papers for 15 years. Marianne, I didn't know. I swear to God. I had no idea you were working at this level. What level did you think I was working at? The question hung in the air, and I could practically hear him trying to construct an answer that wouldn't make him sound completely oblivious to his own sister's professional life. I thought you were, I don't know, a mid-level bureaucrat. I thought you had a desk job that was steady and boring and didn't really matter much in the big picture. A mid-level bureaucrat. Someone whose work didn't matter much in the big picture. It was exactly what I'd suspected they thought, but hearing it stated so bluntly was still jarring. My phone was buzzing with text messages from numbers I didn't recognize. Reporters, probably, who'd gotten my contact information from sources in the housing policy world. But one message caught my attention because it was from a number I did recognize, David, Jennifer's fiancé. Congrats on the nomination. I had no idea I was going to be related to a cabinet secretary. Jennifer's been crying for an hour. Crying. I wondered if they were tears of pride or embarrassment or some combination of both. I wondered if she was finally understanding the magnitude of what she'd been dismissing all these years, or if she was just upset that she'd been caught looking foolish on what was turning into a very public stage, because the ripple effects were accelerating beyond anything I'd anticipated. By 8 p.m., the story had been picked up by local Cleveland news stations, complete with interviews of neighbors and former classmates who were suddenly eager to share their memories of knowing a future cabinet secretary. By 9 p.m., my high school had posted a congratulatory message on their Facebook page, along with a photo from my senior year that made me look approximately 12 years old, but the most telling indicator of how completely the narrative had shifted came in the form of a phone call from my mother at 9:47 p.m. Marianne, sweetheart, your father and I are so proud of you. We always knew you were special, but we had no idea you were being considered for something this important. We always knew you were special. The revisionist history was already beginning, the slow process of rewriting 15 years of family dynamics to make their previous dismissiveness seem like loving support. By tomorrow, they'd probably be telling people they'd always believed in my potential for high-level government service. Thanks, Mom. It's been a long process getting to this point. Oh, I'm sure it has. All those years of hard work and dedication. We're just so grateful that the president recognized your talents. All those years of hard work and dedication that she'd been suggesting I abandon in favor of something more profitable in the private sector. The selective memory was almost impressive in its completeness. Actually, Mom, I wanted to ask you something. Do you remember Sunday dinner 2 weeks ago, when Marcus said I should think about getting a real job outside the government? The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. Marianne, honey, I think there might have been some misunderstanding. No misunderstanding, Mom. Marcus specifically said that government jobs were recession-proof because they didn't require much actual work. Jennifer suggested that I might be happier if I considered other options. You wondered when I was going to find something in the private sector where I could make real money. More silence. We wanted you to have opportunities. I had opportunities, Mom. I've been building toward this for 15 years. You just couldn't see them because you didn't understand what I was actually doing. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with my mother attempting various forms of damage control and historical revision. By the end, she'd managed to convince herself that their concerns had been motivated entirely by love and support, and that they'd always believed in my potential for success. It was a masterclass in cognitive dissonance, and I found myself oddly impressed by the psychological gymnastics required to transform 15 years of dismissive comments into evidence of unwavering family support. By 11 p.m. I'd received over 300 text messages, 150 phone calls, and 89 emails from reporters, colleagues, former classmates, and random strangers who'd somehow obtained my contact information. My LinkedIn profile had gained 2,400 new connections in a single day. The Georgetown University website had posted a news story about my nomination, complete with quotes from professors who remembered my graduate work on urban planning and affordable housing policy, but the most satisfying development came in the form of a Facebook post that one of my cousins shared with me. Marcus had apparently attempted to manage the narrative on social media by posting his own congratulatory message about my nomination. The post read, "So proud of my sister Marianne Thompson, nominated today for HUD Secretary. Always knew she was destined for great things in public service." The comments section was brutal. "Didn't you tell everyone at Christmas that she needed to get a real job? Pretty sure you've been calling her work, boring government paperwork, for years. Suddenly you're proud of public service? What changed? This is the same sister whose career you've been dismissing at every family gathering, right?" Someone had even found and screenshot a Facebook comment Marcus had made just 6 months earlier, responding to an article about government spending. "Most federal employees are just paper pushers who couldn't make it in the private sector." The screenshot was being shared widely, with increasingly sarcastic commentary about the timing. The internet, it turned out, had a very good memory and very little patience for revisionist history. By midnight, I was exhausted but oddly exhilarated. The confirmation process would be intense and demanding, but tonight had proven something I'd suspected for years. My family's casual dismissal of my career had been based on ignorance rather than insight. Their assumption that government work was for people who couldn't succeed elsewhere had been thoroughly and publicly debunked. More importantly, the broader conversation about my nomination was focusing on exactly the right things: my qualifications, my experience, my track record of successful policy development. The housing policy community was rallying around the choice, with advocacy groups and industry leaders issuing statements of support that emphasized my deep knowledge and proven competence. I was going to be confirmed, and I was going to be good at this job. And my family was going to have to reconcile their previous assumptions with the reality of having a cabinet secretary at their Sunday dinner table. The ripple effects were still spreading, but the story was already clear. Sometimes the quiet ones are working on things you can't imagine, and sometimes the people you underestimate are preparing for opportunities you never saw coming. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new scrutiny. But tonight belonged to the satisfaction of watching 15 years of dismissive assumptions crumble in real time on social media. It was better than I could have planned. 3 weeks after the Rose Garden ceremony, I sat in a conference room in the Hart Senate office building, fielding questions from the Senate Banking Committee about my vision for HUD's role in addressing the national housing shortage. The confirmation hearings had been proceeding smoothly for 2 days, with Republicans and Democrats alike focusing on substantive policy questions rather than partisan attacks. "Ms. Thompson," Senator Rebecca Williams began, adjusting her reading glasses as she consulted her notes, "you've spent 15 years working in federal housing policy. What would you say is the most significant challenge facing American families seeking affordable housing today?" This was the kind of question I'd been preparing for my entire career, not just the past 3 weeks. I leaned into the microphone, my voice steady and confident. "Senator Williams, the fundamental challenge is that we're treating housing as a commodity rather than a human necessity. When housing costs consume more than 30% of a family's income, we're not just looking at a budget problem. We're looking at a barrier to economic mobility that affects everything from educational outcomes to healthcare access to retirement security." The committee room was packed with reporters, housing advocates, and policy experts who'd been following my nomination closely. In the gallery, I could see Janet Morrison from the White House Personnel Office, along with several HUD colleagues who'd taken time off to attend the hearings. But in the front row, looking slightly overwhelmed but determined to be supportive, sat my parents. They'd driven down from Cleveland the night before, insisting that they wanted to witness this historic moment in person. Dad was wearing his best suit, the navy blue one he usually reserved for weddings and funerals, while Mom had chosen a dress that screamed, "Proud Government Mother," without being too obvious about it. They'd been taking photos with their phones since arriving at the Capitol, looking like tourists who'd stumbled into the most important meeting of their daughter's professional life. Can you elaborate on your approach to public-private partnerships in affordable housing development? Senator Williams continued. I've answered this question in various forms dozens of times over the years, but never before with C-SPAN cameras broadcasting my response to a national audience. Never before with my parents sitting in the front row, finally understanding what I'd been working toward all these years. Certainly, Senator. The private sector brings efficiency and innovation to housing development, but market forces alone won't solve the affordable housing crisis. Federal policy needs to create incentives that make affordable housing development profitable while ensuring that public investment produces lasting community benefits. As I spoke, I caught sight of my father's expression. He was listening intently, nodding slightly at points that resonated with him, and I realized this might be the first time he'd ever heard me speak about my work in detail. For 15 years, our family conversations about my career had been brief and superficial, deflected by my desire to avoid their glazed eye syndrome and their apparent disinterest in policy complexities, but here, in this formal setting with senators asking serious questions about national housing policy, he was finally seeing what I actually did for a living. He was watching his daughter field complex policy questions from some of the most powerful people in the American government, and doing it with the confidence that came from 15 years of deep expertise. Senator Martinez from Texas leaned into his microphone. Ms. Thompson, some critics have suggested that your background is too narrowly focused on federal programs, that you lack private sector experience that might bring fresh perspectives to HUD. How do you respond to that criticism? It was the question I'd been expecting, the one that touched directly on my family's longtime concerns about my career choices. I smiled slightly before responding. Senator Martinez, I'd respectfully suggest that 15 years of working directly with private sector partners on federal housing initiatives has given me extensive insight into how the private sector operates and what motivates private investment in affordable housing. I've negotiated partnerships with developers, worked with financial institutions on lending programs, and collaborated with nonprofit organizations on community development projects. I paused, glancing briefly at my parents before continuing. But, more importantly, I think the American people deserve a HUD secretary who understands that housing policy isn't about maximizing profits, it's about ensuring that working families can afford to live in the communities where they work. That's a perspective you develop through years of public service, not through private sector experience. The murmur of approval from the gallery was subtle but unmistakable. Housing advocates who'd been following my work for years recognized the implicit critique of previous HUD secretaries who'd come from real estate development backgrounds and had sometimes prioritized industry interests over tenant protections. During the lunch break, my parents joined me in a small conference room where White House staff had arranged for nominees to meet with family members between sessions. Dad looked slightly shell-shocked, while Mom appeared to be processing everything she'd heard during the morning session. "Marianne," Dad said slowly, "I had no idea you were working at this level. Those questions, the way you answered them. You sound like an expert." "I sound like an expert because I am an expert," I thought but didn't say. Instead, I smiled and said, "I've had 15 years to learn this stuff, Dad. It's what I've been doing all this time." "But the way those senators talk to you," Mom added, with such respect. "They were really listening to your answers. They weren't just going through the motions." It was a revealing comment. She seemed genuinely surprised that senators would treat my expertise seriously, as if she'd expected them to see through some kind of elaborate pretense and recognize me as the unremarkable government employee she'd always assumed I was. "Mom, these are serious policy questions about issues that affect millions of American families." Of course they're listening carefully. This isn't a courtesy interview, it's a confirmation hearing for a cabinet position. The afternoon session focused on budget priorities and administrative challenges. Senator Chen from California asked about my plans for addressing regional variations in housing costs, while Senator Thompson from Montana, no relation, despite the shared surname, wanted to know about rural housing initiatives. Each question allowed me to demonstrate the breadth of knowledge I'd accumulated over 15 years of federal service, the kind of expertise that couldn't be acquired quickly or superficially, but the most significant moment came during questioning. From Senator Davis of Pennsylvania, who'd been notably skeptical of several recent HUD nominees. Ms. Thompson, you've been working in government your entire career. Some might argue that gives you a limited perspective on housing markets and development challenges. Why should the American people trust someone who's never had to meet a payroll or worry about market competition? It was a harder version of the question Senator Martinez had asked earlier, and I could see my parents tensing in their seats. This was exactly the kind of criticism they'd been making for years, that government work somehow didn't count as real experience because it didn't involve the financial pressures of private sector employment. Senator Davis, I appreciate the question because it gives me an opportunity to address a common misconception about federal service. Over the past 15 years, I've been responsible for managing programs with budgets in the hundreds of millions of dollars. I've overseen staff, negotiated contracts, and been held accountable for measurable outcomes that directly affect American families. I leaned forward slightly, my voice gaining intensity. But more importantly, I've never had the luxury of walking away from a failed project or changing careers when things got difficult. When federal housing programs don't work, families become homeless. When fair housing enforcement fails, children grow up in segregated communities with unequal opportunities. When disaster recovery programs are poorly managed, families lose everything and have nowhere to turn. The room had gone completely quiet. Even the reporters had stopped typing. Senator, I've spent 15 years knowing that my work directly affects whether a single mother in Detroit can find safe housing for her children, whether a veteran in rural Kentucky can access mortgage assistance, whether a family in Puerto Rico can rebuild after a hurricane. That's not limited perspective, that's accountability to the American people in its purest form. The silence stretched for several seconds before Senator Davis nodded and moved on to his next question. In the gallery, I could see housing advocates exchanging approving glances, while my parents looked like they were seeing me clearly for the first time in their lives. After the hearings concluded for the day, we drove back to my townhouse in Arlington, where I'd invited them to stay rather than at a hotel. The drive gave us our first private conversation since the nomination announcement, and it was unlike any family conversation we'd ever had. Marianne, Mom said from the passenger seat, I owe you an apology. We owe you an apology. Mom, you don't. Yes, I do. We all do. We've been treating your career like it was some kind of backup plan, like you were settling for less than you could achieve. But watching you today, listening to those senators treat you like. She paused, searching for words. Like someone whose opinions actually matter on a national level. I realize we've been completely wrong about what you've been doing all these years. Dad nodded from the back seat. When that senator asked you about your 15 years of experience, and you started talking about specific programs and outcomes, I kept thinking, this is what she's been trying to tell us at family dinners. We just never listened. It was the closest to a real acknowledgement I'd ever received from them, and I found myself unexpectedly emotional. 15 years of feeling misunderstood by the people who should have known me best, 15 years of having my professional accomplishments dismissed or minimized, and it had taken a nationally televised confirmation hearing for them to understand what I'd been trying to communicate all along. The thing is, I said carefully, I tried to share this stuff with you. I tried to explain what I was working on, why it mattered, what kind of impact these programs had. But every time I brought up my work, someone would change the subject or make a joke about government bureaucracy. We thought it was boring, Dad admitted. We thought you were being, I don't know, overly serious about administrative details that didn't really matter to anyone. Administrative details that didn't really matter to anyone. Federal housing policy, reduced to administrative details that didn't matter. It was exactly the kind of dismissive attitude that had driven me to stop sharing my work with them years ago. Dad, those administrative details determine whether families can afford housing. They determine whether communities have access to development funding. They determine whether disaster victims get the help they need to rebuild their lives. The rest of the evening was spent in a different kind of family conversation than we'd ever had before. Instead of deflecting questions about my work, I found myself explaining housing policy in detail, describing the complex interplay between federal regulations and local housing markets, outlining the challenges of balancing competing interests in affordable housing development, and for the first time in 15 years, they listened. Really listened. They asked follow-up questions, made connections to issues they'd heard about in Cleveland, and began to understand why I'd found this work compelling enough to build an entire career around it. The transformation wasn't just happening in our family dynamic. Over the following days, as news coverage of the confirmation hearings continued, I began receiving messages from people across the country who'd watched the proceedings and felt inspired by seeing someone defend the value of public service so articulately. A young woman from Oregon wrote to say she'd decided to apply for federal jobs after watching me explain why government work mattered. A veteran from Texas thanked me for mentioning HUD's role in helping military families access housing assistance. A mother from Louisiana described how federal disaster recovery programs had helped her family rebuild after Hurricane Ida, and said she'd never realized how much expertise went into designing those programs, but the message that affected me most came from my former Georgetown professor, Dr. Sarah Kim, who'd supervised my master's thesis on affordable housing policy 15 years earlier. "Marianne," she wrote, "I've been following your nomination with enormous pride. Not just because you're about to become HUD secretary, but because of how you've represented the field of public policy during the confirmation process. You've shown the country that expertise matters, that dedicated public service creates real value, and that government work can be both intellectually rigorous and morally compelling. You've become exactly the kind of policy leader I hoped you'd become when you were my student." The confirmation vote was scheduled for the following week, and by all accounts, it would be overwhelmingly positive. Republicans and Democrats alike had been impressed by my command of housing policy details and my clear commitment to HUD's mission. Editorial boards at major newspapers had endorsed my nomination, calling me extraordinarily well qualified and exactly what HUD needs. But the real transformation wasn't happening in Washington. It was happening in Cleveland, where my family was finally understanding what I'd been building toward all these years. It was happening in conversations with other federal employees who felt validated by seeing one of their own rise to cabinet level. It was happening among young people considering careers in public service who now had an example of how expertise and dedication could lead to genuine influence and impact. 15 years of quiet competence had culminated in a very public validation that government work, the right kind of government work, pursued with intelligence and integrity, could indeed matter on a national scale. The transformation was complete, but the real work was just beginning. 6 months after my confirmation as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, I stood behind the podium in the HUD headquarters auditorium, looking out at an audience that included the president, congressional leaders from both parties, housing advocates, and the career civil servants who'd become my closest allies in transforming federal housing policy. We were announcing the most comprehensive affordable housing initiative in decades, a program that would affect millions of American families over the next 10 years, but in the third row, sitting between my chief of staff and the deputy secretary, were my parents, beaming with the kind of pride that had been completely absent from family gatherings for 15 years. Next to them sat Jennifer and David, who'd driven down from Cleveland specifically to witness what Jennifer had started calling Marianne's latest world-changing moment. Even Marcus was there, having rearranged his development schedule to attend what he now referred to as my sister's cabinet meeting. The transformation in family dynamics had been swift and thorough. Where once they'd offered unsolicited career advice, they now asked thoughtful questions about housing policy. Where once they'd suggested I consider private sector opportunities, they now bragged to anyone who would listen about their daughter and sister, the cabinet secretary. Where once Sunday dinners had featured gentle mockery of my boring government job, they now featured detailed discussions of HUD initiatives and their potential impact on Cleveland's housing market. "Today," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system, "we're announcing the Comprehensive Housing Opportunity Act, a 10-year, $50 billion initiative that will fundamentally reshape how America approaches affordable housing development, fair housing enforcement, and community investment." The applause was immediate and sustained. This wasn't just another federal program announcement. It was the culmination of 6 months of intensive policy development, congressional negotiation, and stakeholder engagement that had begun within days of my confirmation. The program represented everything I'd learned about effective housing policy over 15 years of federal service, packaged into a legislative framework that could actually pass Congress and make a measurable difference in American communities. The CHOA will establish housing trust funds in all 50 states, create tax incentives for affordable housing development in high-opportunity areas, and strengthen fair housing enforcement with measurable accountability standards, I continued. But more importantly, it recognizes that housing policy isn't just about buildings, it's about creating pathways to economic mobility for families who have been locked out of opportunity for too long. As I outlined the program's key components, I could see housing advocates in the audience taking notes, policy experts nodding approvingly, and reporters preparing questions for the press conference that would follow. But I was also acutely aware of my family's presence, their obvious pride in watching me announce federal policy that would be debated on cable news shows and analyzed in academic journals. The irony wasn't lost on me. 6 months ago, they'd been suggesting I consider other options because my government career seemed to lack advancement potential. Now they were watching me announce a $50 billion federal initiative from behind the podium of a cabinet-level department, with the President of the United States nodding approvingly from the front row. After the formal announcement, the reception gave me an opportunity to introduce my family to colleagues they'd heard me mention but never met. They shook hands with deputy assistant secretaries whose names appeared regularly in housing policy publications, chatted with congressional staff who'd worked on the legislation, and met housing advocates whose organizations had been fighting for exactly these kinds of comprehensive reforms. Secretary Thompson, said Maria Santos, executive director of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, as she approached our small group. I wanted to thank you personally for including tenant protection provisions in the CHOA framework. That language is going to make a real difference for families facing displacement. Maria's organization has been pushing for stronger tenant protections for years, I explained to my parents. Their research was crucial in developing the displacement prevention components of the program. My father looked genuinely interested. A marked change from the polite but distant attention he'd paid to my work in previous years. Ms. Santos, how does federal legislation like this actually affect individual families? I mean, how does a billion-dollar program translate into someone being able to afford an apartment? It was exactly the kind of thoughtful question he'd never asked during 15 years of family dinners, and Maria launched into an enthusiastic explanation of how federal housing vouchers worked, how funding formulas determined local program capacity, and how policy changes could expand access for families who'd been on waiting lists for years. As I watched my father engage seriously with housing policy details, asking follow-up questions and making connections to issues he'd observed in Cleveland, I realized that his previous dismissal of my work hadn't been malicious. It had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what federal housing policy actually involved and why it mattered to real people's lives. The same transformation was happening with Jennifer, who'd spent the afternoon talking with my communications director about the challenges of explaining complex policy initiatives to diverse audiences. Her marketing background was actually relevant to HUD's work, and she'd been asking sophisticated questions about how we measured program effectiveness and communicated outcomes to stakeholders. Marianne, she said as we found a quiet corner of the reception, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you recognition that you've been working on stuff that actually matters while I've been developing campaigns to sell people things they don't need. It was a stark admission, and one that reflected a broader shift in how she'd been thinking about her own career since my nomination. She'd mentioned during our last phone conversation that she was considering applying for communications positions with nonprofit organizations, drawn by the possibility of using her skills for work that had a social impact beyond quarterly profit reports. Jennifer, marketing is important too. But I'm glad you're starting to understand why I found this work compelling enough to build a career around it. Marcus, meanwhile, had spent the afternoon in what could only be described as animated conversation with HUD's Community Development Block Grant Director, discussing how federal funding intersected with local development projects. His real estate background was actually valuable in understanding the complexities of affordable housing development, and he'd been asking increasingly sophisticated questions about land use planning, zoning reform, and public-private partnerships. You know what's crazy, he said as the reception began winding down. I've been doing development work for 15 years, and I never really understood how much federal policy affects local housing markets. The stuff you've been working on actually determines whether projects like mine are financially viable. It was a moment of recognition that went beyond family dynamics. Marcus was realizing that the boring government bureaucracy he'd been dismissing was actually the regulatory and funding framework that made his own career possible. Federal housing policy wasn't some abstract academic exercise. It was the foundation that shaped how housing markets functioned at every level. 3 hours later, we were back at my townhouse in Arlington, sharing takeout Chinese food and continuing conversations that had started at the reception. But these weren't the superficial family catch-up conversations of previous years. They were substantive discussions about policy implementation, community development strategies, and the challenges of translating federal initiatives into local outcomes. Marianne, Mom said as we settled into my living room with wine and fortune cookies, I have to ask you something I probably should have asked years ago. Why did you choose this work? What made you want to spend your career on housing policy? It was a question she'd never asked during 15 years of suggesting I consider other career options, and I realized that her previous advice had been based on assumptions about my motivations rather than any understanding of what actually drove my professional choices. Remember when I was in college, and I did that internship with the Cleveland Housing Authority? I began. I was assigned to work on a project relocating families from condemned public housing units, and I met this woman, Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd been living in the same apartment for 12 years with her 3 kids. The room went quiet as I continued the story I'd tried to tell them multiple times over the years, but which had always been interrupted or dismissed as too academic or policy-focused. The apartment had black mold, broken windows, and heating. That worked maybe half the time. But Mrs. Rodriguez was terrified to move because she didn't understand the voucher system, didn't know how to navigate the private rental market, and was afraid her kids would have to change schools. She was trapped in housing that was making her family sick because the system was too complicated and intimidating for her to access better options. I paused, remembering the frustration I'd felt as a 20-year-old intern trying to help a family navigate bureaucratic complexities that seemed designed to discourage rather than assist people. I spent 3 weeks working with Mrs. Rodriguez, explaining how vouchers worked, helping her search for apartments, connecting her with rental assistance programs she didn't know existed. When she finally moved into a safe, decent apartment in a better neighborhood, her youngest daughter's asthma attacks decreased by 80%. Her oldest son's grades improved because he wasn't embarrassed to bring friends home anymore. The silence in the room was profound. This was the story behind my career choice, the human impact that had motivated 15 years of policy development work, and they were hearing it clearly for the first time. That's when I realized that housing policy isn't about buildings or budgets, I continued. It's about whether children grow up healthy, whether families have stability, whether communities can thrive. Everything else I've done since then has been trying to fix the systems that failed Mrs. Rodriguez, trying to make sure other families don't have to navigate impossible bureaucracies to access basic human needs. Dad set down his wine glass carefully. Marianne, why didn't you ever tell us this story? I tried to, Dad. Many times. But every time I started talking about housing policy or federal programs, someone would change the subject or make a joke about government bureaucracy. You trained me to stop sharing the parts of my work that I was most passionate about. The acknowledgement hung in the air between us, heavy with years of missed connections and misunderstood motivations. But it also felt like the beginning of something new, a foundation for family relationships based on actual understanding rather than comfortable assumptions. From now on, Jennifer said quietly, we want to hear these stories. We want to understand what you're working on and why it matters. We've missed 15 years of really knowing our sister, and that's on us. The evening continued with the kind of conversation I'd always hoped to have with my family but had stopped believing was possible. They asked about specific HUD programs, wanted to understand how federal funding reached local communities, and expressed genuine interest in the policy challenges I dealt with every day, but the most significant moment came when Marcus, who'd spent years questioning my ambition and advancement prospects, asked a question that revealed how completely his perspective had shifted. Marianne, what's next for you? I mean, you're a cabinet secretary at 38. Where do you go from here? It was exactly the kind of career advancement question he'd been asking for years, but now it came from a place of respect rather than concern about my limited prospects. He was asking what someone does after reaching one of the highest levels of government service, not whether I should consider leaving government for better opportunities. Honestly, Marcus, I'm focused on implementing the CHOA and making sure it actually works for families like Mrs. Rodriguez. After that, who knows? Maybe I'll run for office, maybe I'll lead a policy institute, maybe I'll go back to direct service work. But whatever I do, it'll be about housing and community development because that's what I'm good at and what I care about. The conversation continued past midnight, covering everything from policy implementation challenges to the personal costs of public service to the satisfaction of building programs that could outlast any individual administration. It was the kind of deep, substantive family discussion I'd been hoping for since graduate school, finally happening because they'd seen public validation of work they'd never understood. 3 weeks later, I was back in Cleveland for Jennifer's engagement party, but this time the family dynamics were completely different. Instead of deflecting questions about my work, I found myself explaining HUD initiatives to extended family members who seemed genuinely interested in federal housing policy. Instead of enduring gentle suggestions about private sector opportunities, I was fielding questions about how local communities could access federal funding for development projects, but the most telling moment came when my Uncle Jerry, who'd spent years ribbing me about my government paycheck, approached me at the party with a serious question. Marianne, my neighbor's been trying to get housing assistance for his disabled veteran son, but he's getting nowhere with the bureaucracy. Is there someone he should be talking to? It was exactly the kind of question that illustrated how completely the family narrative had shifted. Uncle Jerry was asking me to use my position and expertise to help someone navigate federal programs, recognizing that my boring government job actually gave me the knowledge and connections to solve real problems for real people. I gave him the contact information for HUD's Veterans Affairs Supportive Housing Program Coordinator, along with specific guidance about documentation requirements and application procedures. But more importantly, I realized that this was what I'd always wanted: family members who understood that my work had value beyond job security and pension benefits, who saw government service as a way to make meaningful contributions to other people's lives. 6 months after the nomination announcement that had shocked my family into recognizing my actual qualifications, we'd built a completely new foundation for our relationships. It was based on understanding rather than assumptions, respect rather than condescension, and genuine interest in each other's work and values. The boring government job that had once been a source of family concern had become a source of family pride. Not because external validation had changed what I did, but because external validation had forced them to see what I'd been doing all along, and that foundation, built on truth rather than comfortable misconceptions, was proving to be much stronger than anything that had come before. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.